So to this point in chapter 4, we've worked through greatest common factor. We've talked about factoring by grouping, and I've seen that in action as we factored trinomials. And so we're doing 4.3 now, which is really just more of the same. I didn't teach you the shortcut in 4.2. I only taught you the long cut because you can use that same strategy for both the 4.2 and the 4.3. The danger of the shortcut that I talked about in the last video is that it does not work for these ones. So when you have something other than a 1 here, no shortcut. And so most of the time, students are keen to do the long cut because I've been drilling it through these two sections. But really knowing when you're allowed to and when you're not is something that's really important. So the AC method, the AC test, as I sometimes said, we always want to start with the greatest common factor and see if we can knock the numbers down a little bit so we're not dealing with so much. This one says multiply A times C and write it down. Make a little chart to list all the factors. This sounds like what we did in 4.2. From your little chart, determine which two factors add to get to B. Those two numbers are used to decompose the middle term or split the middle term apart. We're going to factor by grouping and pull out the two binomials. You can always check from FOIL. So here's our example. You can see that we have 2 times 9 for a positive 18 at the top of our chart. It's factored in as many ways as possible. And those are the two numbers that we choose to decompose our middle term. Factor by grouping, keep factoring, and there's your polynomial in factored form. Let's try some of these ones. Okay, so for A here, I would have at the top of my number puzzle 6 times -4. So all the other ones that we were doing last section were 1 times this number, but now it's 6 times this number, so -24. We're going to factor 24 in as many ways as possible. I'll come back to the signs. I can see that I've got a middle term being negative, and so that means that my bigger of the two terms are going to be negative and the smallers are going to be positive. And this should lead me to select which combination of factors fit my number puzzle or satisfy the AC test. Which factors add together to give me my B term, all right, that -5. So we copy the first term, we expand the middle term, we copy the last term, and now I have 4 terms, so it's factoring by grouping. Looking at the first 2 terms, I have a 3x common to those, and factoring that out, in the brackets I would be left with a 2x and a +1. Taking a look at the second 2 terms, I have a negative sticking out there, so I have a -4 as my common factor. Putting down the brackets and factoring a -4 out. Sometimes I show my work, sometimes I don't. I do it oftentimes when there's a negative so I don't make a mistake. And when I get to this line, this is where I've got those matching brackets. And so those matching brackets are now my common factors. So as always, write down your common factor, put down the brackets, and you fill the brackets up by what's left over when you divide out that greatest common factor. So I don't always show my work on this, but for the first one on the page, I thought I would. And so now we have this in factored form. And at the end of the 4.2 material, I said, look, you could just find that shortcut. Look back to your number puzzle because those are the numbers that are in your answer. But here you'll see that there isn't that correlation. You can't do the shortcut. You have to do that decomposition. You have to split open that middle term and then factor by grouping. There's no way to just look at your number puzzle and go to the shortcut. So for the next one, I would take a look, is there a greatest common factor? Because these are big numbers, and unfortunately there isn't. So that means that I have 3 times 15 at the top of my number puzzle. So that's a 45 or a positive 45 at the top of my number puzzle. I'd have 1 and 45. I'd have 3 and 15 and 5 and 9. I have a positive 45. I also have a positive b term. And so that means that all my factors are going to be positive. These ones are easier, I think. And that leads me to say that 5 and 9 are what's going to fit my AC test because they add to 14. They're factors of 45, but they also add to my b term. So they're the numbers that are going to decompose this middle term. So I rewrite it, decomposing my middle term, and now I've got 4 terms. So it's factoring by grouping. Oop, that's a positive in there. Looking at the first 2 terms, I have a common x, and so factoring that out, I'd get a 3x plus 5. And then looking at the second 2 terms, I'd have a positive 3 as a common factor, and that would leave me with a 3x plus 5. I now have the 3x plus 5 common to both terms that I have here, and then factoring that out, I'd be left with an x plus 3. These ones should be reversible. I should be able to reverse engineer them. I didn't check that first one, but I could FOIL this one out to check it out. So foiling, I'd end up with a 3x squared, and outside would give me a plus 9x, and inside would give me a plus 5x, and a last would give me a plus 15. And collecting your middle like terms, I'm back to my original question. So these ones you can always check. And again, you'll notice that numbers in your number puzzle are not your answer. And so no shortcut in these, which is why I taught you the long cut in the first place. So 2 more on this page, and then we've got 4 more for you to try on the other. This should feel like a bit of a review because we did a little extra work on the 4.2 section. So for C, I'd have 2 times negative 7, so negative 14 at the top of my number puzzle. I'd have 1 and 14 and 2 and 7, factoring that as many ways as possible. I have a negative 14, so that means that I have 1 factor positive, 1 factor negative. I see that I have a negative b term, so that means that my bigger factors get to be negative this time. And that helps me select the combination of factors that finish up or satisfy my AC test. They add together to give me my b term. So I recopy or rewrite it, expanding or decomposing that middle term, not changing the value. So now that I have 4 terms, I can factor by grouping. First 2 terms, I factor. Second 2 terms. Now I have this case where I have a common binomial factor. So I pull that out, and then in the brackets, I write what's left behind. One more on this page, starting out with the number puzzle, I'd have 3 times positive 7 at the top of it, so positive 21. Factoring that as many ways as I can. I was just curious here. I was like, what's gone wrong? This isn't working. It's not factorable. Caught me. I wasn't looking at my key. I'm like, why this doesn't work? So it fails the AC test. We had another one of those last section. So it's just a reminder that sometimes this happens. It fails the AC test. And so it's not factorable. All right, top of the next page. Top of the next page, we have more to take a look at. So I recognize I've got 3 terms, which pushes me into the AC test. I have 4 times 6, so positive 24 at the top of my number puzzle. Factoring that all out, I have a positive 24, but I have a negative b term. So that means that all my factors are going to be negative. And so now I can find the combination that finishes or totally satisfies my AC test. They need to add together to give me my B term. So I rewrite the first term, decompose that middle term. Now I have 4 terms, so I can factor by grouping. The first 2 terms have an x in common, and factoring that out, I'd be left with a 4x minus 3. The last two terms have a -2 in common, and factoring that out, I'd be left with a 4x and a -3. Now it's that 4x minus 3 that is common to my two massive terms here, and factoring that out, I'd be left with an x minus 2. Next one, I'm going to talk these all the way through. I have 2 times 9 at the top of my number puzzle, so a positive 18 at the top of my number puzzle. Factoring that out, I'd have 1 and 18, or 2 and 9, or 3 and 6. I have a positive 18, but I have a negative b term, so that tells me that all of my terms need to be negative. Also leads me to believe that -3 and -6 are going to be the values that decompose that middle term because they add together to give me that -9. So I'd have 2x squared minus 3x minus 6x plus 9. Factoring by grouping, I have an x common to the first two terms, and I have a -3 common to the second two terms. And so now I have that bracket in common, and factoring it out, I'm left with the x minus 3. Again, no shortcut from the number puzzle to your answer. Sometimes students will ask also, does it matter which order you put these two in? And it doesn't matter. So you might have a different line of algebra, you might have a different bracket, but you should end up in the same place. So if you switch these two, that's what I'm saying, right? Like if you happen to write these two terms in the opposite order, it won't matter. I tend to do these the same every time. So sometimes you might not notice that until you've done a number of questions on your own, but it won't matter. You could try one doing it that way, and you'll end up with the same answer. 2 more to do. These two look a little different, but we're going to try and trust our strategy of the AC test. These look a little different because we've got an x squared term, an x term, and a nothing, but we also have this y term that's actually stepping up in degree in this. So sometimes we have trinomials that look like this, and they also fit the AC test. So we're going to stay with that strategy. When you have 3 terms, try the AC test. So the AC test would have us put 6 times -10 at the top of the number puzzle, and -60 is a nasty one because there's so many factors of 60. So listing them all out and taking our time. Sometimes the right numbers will pop to you, but I find it kind of methodical and almost calming to do all of the answers or all of the factors. So now I've got this case of sign. I've got a -60 at the top, but I have a positive b term. So that means that the larger of the factors are going to be positive and the smaller of the factors are going to be negative. This one may have popped out at you before you put all of the signs in which case that's absolutely fine because those are the factors that satisfy that second criteria of our AC test. These are the numbers that are going to decompose that middle term. So same as I've been doing, I keep the variable the same because I want to preserve the value of this. I'm just changing the way it looks. I've got 4 terms, so now I'm going to factor by grouping. So I've got an x common to the first 2 terms, and that would leave me with a 6 minus 5y in the brackets. The second set of terms, I have a positive 2y common to those two, and dividing each by 2y, and writing what's left over in the brackets, I'd have a 6. Oh, shoot, what did I just do? Oh, I dropped the x right there. 6x minus 5y. So now I have that 6x minus 5y common to both, and I've got the x plus 2y as my second bracket. Last one, I'd have 9 times 4, so a positive 36 at the top of my number puzzle. I'd want to factor this in as many ways as I can. I've got a positive 36. I look to my B term, I've got a positive number. So that means that all my terms are going to be positive. It's these last two, it's 6 and 6, that would add together to give me my positive 12. So it's these values, these 6's, that are going to decompose my middle term. I've got another one of these with the x squared moving to a y squared through the trinomial, but I'm going to stay with it with my strategy that's been working so far. Once I have 4 terms, I can factor by grouping. Getting a bit squishy in here. I've got, what have I got? I've got a 3x common to the first 2 terms, and factoring that out would leave me with a 3x plus 2y. And then when I take a look at the second 2 terms, I have a plus 2 y common to those 2. And so that would leave me with a 3x plus 2y. So now it's that 3x plus 2y that's actually common to both of my big terms. And factoring that out, I'd have the 3x plus 2y. This one is acceptable as an answer, but it's also good to recognize that it is a squared binomial. So that's the end of our AC tests. If we were to keep track of what we've been doing, we've been talking about greatest common factor first. So I'm going to do a little, I'm going to switch colors. I don't have a lot of space here, but we talked about in factoring, we have greatest common factor. We've talked about 4 terms with factoring by grouping. In class, I usually do this as a review. In 3 terms, it's the AC test, regardless if it has a 1 in this first location or a number. The last part of this in 4.4, it moves into what if there are 2 terms? And so we're going to carry on with this 4.4 and what if there are 2 terms?